All right, so as Joe explained, what we're trying to do is we're transitioning from our worship into Bible study hour. So that way you have an opportunity to be able to ask questions, to be able to speak out, and that's why we wanted to make a separation or a distinction between our worship and what we're doing now. And so what we're going to be doing is what we call Second Sunday Essentials. And I do have a PowerPoint there, Connie, if you'll start that for me. And what we're thinking, and the reason this came about is, you remember several weeks ago, Joe Wilson made an announcement that we want to have basically like a fundamentals type class, something along those lines that will help people to better understand the Bible. And the main reason for that is because we had so many baptisms. We have so many new Christians that it's hard to be able to teach one-on-one. We decided to have a class. Well, then that has expanded. We thought, you know what, the entire congregation needs this, and you'll see why, we'll say in just a few moments, because of a test, a homework assignment that I have for you that I think you'll find to be a little difficult, and that's a good thing. And so what do we mean by Second Sunday Essentials? Well, we're talking about fundamental elements of Christianity. Well, what are those fundamental elements? Well, it's going to be things like, for example, we're going to look at and start with the Bible timeline. You know, there's so many people that just do not understand exactly how the Bible is laid out, what's involved in the chronology of the Bible. If you've been in Joe Wilson's Acts class or watching it online, you'll notice that he puts a timestamp on everything, and he even puts a timestamp to the point where he'll say, all right, in that verse, we've already jumped so many years. And that's exactly how your mind needs to be working and operating, because these are real people, these are real events happening in real history. And so that's why a timeline is so important. That's what we're going to start with tonight in just a few moments. But we're also going to study the Bible books. Maybe I don't want to embarrass you, but how many of you can right now name all of the books of the Bible? If I were to say, let's name them all. Most of our kids can, all right? We got several that can, but not everybody raised their hands. Wouldn't it be nice to know the Bible books and be able to rattle them off? Well, I think that's what we need to be. You know, so many of us in this room, not me, but many of you, can name off all the statistics of all the football players and all of the baseball players, or you know all the prices of the specials in town, or you know all these statistics and things, right? Well, shouldn't we know just as much about the Bible as we know about worldly things? And that's why we want to give you these essentials. We're also going to look at the various personalities of the book. There are so many personalities in there that we're going to try to give you a glimpse of those so that you know who these people are. And then geography, essentially, Bible geography, these places where things took place. You can go there today and see many of the places, as we've talked about so often before. The culture. How often have you heard Bible teachers and preachers talking about how the culture plays a part in this particular passage that we're studying? And so we'll study that, and we'll talk about culture. And then, of course, doctrine. And whenever we talk about doctrine, there's so many things that we could talk about. First and foremost is that the Bible is essential. The Bible is infallible. It is, you can trust the Bible, and the Bible is the sole authority in all things that have to do with spiritual things. And then, of course, the doctrines of salvation, the doctrines of worship, the Godhead, Messiahship, the cessation of miracles, of angels and demons, and even Bible versions. So what do you think? Does that sound like information that you would like to have? I see a lot of heads shaking up and down. All right. You know, we may have even studied all these things in our lifetime, and it's good to have a refresher, even if you have studied all of these. And so we're praying that this Second Sunday Essentials will do exactly that. It will help build you up, and primarily our new Christians as well, to help them develop their faith. Now, we mentioned the Bible timeline. You know, as I mentioned, it's hard to really understand and capture the Bible if you don't know where everything fits. And the reason being is because the Bible is not written in chronological form. And so if it's not written in chronological order, and all of a sudden you're reading about somebody who was born before somebody else, and yet it starts to get confusing. This book is here and this book is there, and why are they in that order and things like that. Well, if you have the Bible timeline, if you know what the timeline is, you can have a better understanding. Joe, you like to always put an emphasis on Bible timeline. Why is Bible timeline so important? Data points, there it is. Just like putting a puzzle together, and no different than what we do in our own lives. You know your own genealogy, don't you? Most of you know who your grandparents are and where they lived and what time frame they lived. If I say the War of Northern Aggression, do y'all know what I'm talking about? No? The Civil War is another name for it. If I say that, do you know what date I'm talking about approximately? Was that like last year? No, it feels like it to some degree, doesn't it? But no, that was what, 150 years ago or more, right? 170 years ago. It's a long time ago. So we do that all the time with personalities and data points of where to place things. Now, I notice most of you have gotten this. What do you think? Is that a difficult task right there? Can you go down that list and tell me where, for example, JL? Where does JL fit in the patriarchal, Mosaical, or Christian? Do you know the differences between the patriarchal, Mosaical, and Christian? All right, so this is actually homework for next month, because what we'll do is we will talk about dispensation. Now, when we talk about Bible timeline, this is just one way to look at Bible timeline. There are multiple ways to look at chronology, to look at Bible timeline. One of those ways is this wonderful list that Joe Wilson, y'all know Joe's a numbers guy? You know, y'all know that, right? And here are all Joe's numbers that he's put together, and this is a great list, and we'll make this available to you, of putting dates for when certain things happen. Me personally, I'm a visual kind of guy, and so I like to see things kind of in their little boxes. That's kind of the way my life is. Everything has its little box, except Andrea. Andrea is all over the place for me, right? But I like to put things in little boxes and know where everything goes, and so that's why we're going to look at this Bible timeline. And I know you can't see that very well, but I'll make this available on our website so you can see it. So what you're looking at right here is basically little boxes. And what we have is we have Noah right up here. There's Noah. And then underneath him we have Shem, which is his son, one of his sons. And it's through Shem that we have the promise that continues. So you have Terah, then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, you'll notice that there's a red line there, and it says, I think you can read that, where it says the flood. All right? Well, this is where going back to the beginning, you see the arrow on the bottom there, and can you make out a little book? Can you see that little book? And it says Genesis right there. And you'll notice that little book Genesis, it's going both directions. That's because the book of Genesis covers this time frame from the time of creation up to the time of Joseph's death. All right, so the end of Abraham's line, whenever they enter into Egypt. And so that's what Genesis covers. Now notice there's another book there in that same time frame, that same timeline. Can anybody read that, what it says? The book of Job. Some of y'all may not have known that Job is in that time frame. It fits within the time frame of Genesis. Now, you go back, so what about the beginning? Going back to the very beginning back over here. Well, there are several different ways of calculating this, and this is where discrepancies begin to come in, because you have archaeologists versus biblical estimations of the age of the earth. Now, there are two different levels of archaeology. There is what is modern science archaeology, that a lot of it is based upon evolution and things like that, and so they have to fit their timeline. They look at stuff. They have certain dating methods that they use, which, by the way, not a single one of them is flawless. Not a single one of them is perfect. And so you can get dates on things that are not necessarily true. Or there could be another explanation. It is not steadfast. So what do you believe? Do you believe that? Or then you have archaeologists who do have kind of a Bible sense in mind, and they're digging and looking in places, but yet they have discrepancies of where the beginning of the earth is. And then, of course, there's the biblical timeline. And this is where faith comes in. You have to have faith. I mean, where are you going to put your faith? You're going to put it in scientists that are basically evolutionary based in their thinking, and they're relying on, which, by the way, for example, carbon dating has been proven to be faulty, right? Carbon dating used to be the thing, and we've now learned that it is faulty. It is not a constant rate of decay. Well, the same thing can be said about isotopes and all kinds of other datings that they do. So there are different, they're starting to look at different theories and ideas, and there's different ways of looking at the age of the earth. That's not what this class is about, just letting you know that's where discrepancies come from. But even in the Bible theology world, you have people, for example, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton calculated the earth to be about 6,000 years old, dating from this time, from 2000, but he dated the beginning of the earth at around 4,000 BC. So did an archbishop by the name of Usher. He did the same thing. He calculated about 4,000 BC. Did y'all know that Martin Luther also did some calculations, and he calculated the beginning of the earth at around 3,961 BC. The traditional Jewish date is 3,760 BC, and the traditional Greek Orthodox thought is that it was 5,009 BC. There's some big differences there. So nobody really knows. It's hard to calculate, but the way we calculate it is from certain markers that we have in the Bible, and then we go and we look at the Bible genealogies that tell us the amount of time and different births and lives and everything, and then we start counting backwards. That's how that works. And so if you really want to know the answer, who do you go to? Joe Wilson, right? And Joe Wilson has 4,118. And I agree with that. About 4,000 years, 4,000 BC is the beginning of the earth, approximately. And I know that that's difficult for some people, and like I say, we can have another study about the age of the earth and how we arrive at that very confidently, not just a leap of faith. Faith is based on evidence. But anyway, so moving on, we move from creation up to the flood. So you either count from creation and, go ahead. Adam and Eve, yes. We're talking about creation, we're talking about Adam and Eve. From the time of creation. When you go to Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, right? Yeah, 4,000 BC to Christ, and then 2,000 years since Christ. So 6,000 total, all right? Little over 6,000. 6,000, few hundred years here and there. There's no way of knowing perfectly because all we have are these dates. Now, these ages. Now you come to the next major event, which is the flood. And so you either count from the creation or you count from the present backwards. And again, using certain markers, you're going to wind up with certain dates. And so from creation, it's about 1,656 years up to the flood, depending on how you count. If you go backwards, for example, if you go to the website Answers in Genesis, they'll give you all the reasons and how they come to their date, but they count back, and they come up with 2,348 BC. On my particular chart that I drew here, and I looked for my references of why I landed at 2,515 as the time of the flood. Joe doesn't actually have it on here. He just shows when Noah was born and when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born. So right around the 2,500 mark. But it all depends. In fact, on the wall chart back here in the young adults room, it says that it was 2,348. So that's whenever it was. But if you'll notice, look at all the different dates that other people say. So right here you've got Josephus dating it at 3,046. And this Usher I mentioned earlier at 2348. So once again, nobody really knows. It's hard to calculate that exactly, but we can have a general idea that it was about somewhere in the 2,000 to 2,500 mark, all right? So you're looking at the beginning of the earth around 4,000 BC, the flood somewhere around 2,500. Is everybody tracking with me so far? All right. So then, now you're on the other side of the flood. By the way, that's called, before the flood is called antediluvian, and then after the flood is postdiluvian. And this is all part of the patriarchal period. What do we mean by patriarchs, y'all? The fathers, exactly. God spoke directly to the fathers, specifically thinking of people like Noah. And then you'll notice this step line. So this is genealogy you're looking at here. You have Noah, then Shem, and through Shem is Terah is born. And then through Terah is Abraham. Once again, the date of Abraham is a little bit difficult to nail down. I have here on Joe's list, he has 2,167. I think that's about what mine lines up with. But there are some that they'll look at that, and they'll look at the passage, for example, in 1 Kings 6. It talks about how long Israel was in captivity, and then they'll start counting backwards from there, counting the ages and stuff. They come up with about 251 years, and so by the time you add all that together, you land at 2,128. Some people say he was born in 1996 BC. And so somewhere around 2000 really is, that's the date you kind of need to put in your head, is when Abraham was born and lived. Then through Abraham, you'll notice in these colors, you have this blue, and then there's this purple. And I'll talk about the purple more in just a second, but I want you to notice that purple. You know the story, right? You know this part of the story pretty well. You have Abraham. Who comes next? Isaac. Who comes after Isaac, y'all? Huh? Jacob. What else is Jacob's name? Israel. God changes his name to Israel. And Israel gives birth to who? 12 sons. Very good. That's exactly right. Now notice I have Joseph on there. That's simply because we know that Joseph winds up dividing that into two different tribes. All right, everybody tracking with me so far? All right, we continue. So that top line is the book of Genesis, and it's going from the creation up to the end of Joseph. Now you come into the book of Exodus there on the bottom. We're starting over, all right, going back and starting over from that side of the page. And you'll notice that we're coming into, you see the book there, it says Exodus, right? All right, somewhere right around 1730, they went from a time of prosperity to a time of slavery, all right? Time of slavery, and this is the time whenever Israel is in slavery. So if I zoom in here, you can see a little bit closer, and there's a very important verse, Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, which says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years." All right, now there is some discrepancy here because sometimes they say 480 years. But 430 years according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. Now, you can take that time and start looking at when things were happening. And whenever you do that, then you land at a very, very important date, and that is that the Exodus happens around the year 1446. 46, 47, depending on, again, how you date it. And that's that blue line. All right. So the purple. Let me back up. And you see the purple line up on top. And notice it comes out from Jacob. That's because this is the beginning of the seed promise. What do I mean by seed promise, y'all? What's the seed promise? What did God say to Abraham in his promise? He would bless all nations, and that his seed, in other words, his descendants would be what? As numerous? There you go. So there it is. That's the seed promise. And so you're going to see this purple line continue all the way through until we get to Jesus. Yes? That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Or precede mistreatment. Yep. That's right. And that's what they claim. Well, he does that because he is going to deliver the Messiah. Basically, he starts out with half of humanity. And so he starts out in Genesis 3:15. He says, through your seed, talking to who? The woman, right? So half of humanity, he goes there. And then he chooses a family, and then he goes down to a tribe, and then it comes down smaller and smaller till you get to the Messiah. As far as why he picked exactly that instead of Ishmael does anybody have a plausible answer that they like to give? Go ahead. Not just Israel. Right. And then you got to consider that Sarah is his legitimate wife. And so really the seed line would come legitimately through that. I saw a hand up over here was going to say same thing. Yes. Yep. It's a salvation promise, but I do see what you're saying, Crystal, is that why the Muslim would be so upset about it. All right, so you're going to see this purple line, and we're not going to have enough time to be able to dive into all the details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed up real fast and give you the overall picture. And then next month we'll come back and we'll pick up on some of the detail to be able to finish it out. So if we come in and we see where now the 12 tribes of Israel, that's going to be what carries the seed promise. And then that brings you up to 1446, as I mentioned. And then how long were they wandering in the wilderness? 40 years. So you subtract 40 from 1446, 47, what do you get? 1406. And so that is the next big date, is whenever they go into the promised land, the conquest. And that comes back to what I started with this idea of archaeology. You see, even in that date, there are people who argue about various things. For example, in Jericho, they are doing some studies, and an archaeologist found a place where there was some destruction. He did some dating according to pottery, and guess what? He landed on the date of 1406, exactly what the Bible says if you do all the calculations based off of the different markers that we have, like 1 Kings chapter 6 and so forth. Well, then an archaeologist comes along later and says, no, that's not correct, and she has it up to 200 years before that. Or I'm trying to remember, later. She has it later, which then messes up all of they even says that Jericho didn't even exist at the time of the conquest. Well, somebody did come along later and showed where she made all kinds of mistakes, but it just goes to show how sometimes your data points can get messed up because of the different findings that people have. All right, so real quickly, we're going to run out of time, so let me just go through the rest so you can see what the timeline looks like. I will post this on our website, and I encourage you to study it. And then next month, when we come back to do this, we'll dive into this section right here, which is when they come in and you have the books, it's Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua and the tabernacle. And then you have a problem with the judges, because there's a specific amount of time that is listed for the judges. Anybody know what that time is? 300 years, all right? And we're going to talk about that and how they get to that. But notice what books are there along with Judges. You see the book of Ruth? See, that book falls right inside that same time frame as the Judges, when you have people like Deborah and Gibeon and Samson and so forth. Now, notice that purple line. If you follow that purple line, that now leads into where you have your kings. They wanted a king. And who was the first king of Israel? Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel. And then, who comes after Saul? David. And who follows David? His son Solomon. And each one of those is 40 years. Notice inside there, you'll notice different books in there. There's 1st and 2nd Samuel. You'll see inside there's also prophets. There's different people that were there, and then all the different books. And then you'll notice that this splits into the two kingdoms with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and you have all the kings in the north, all the kings in the south. You have all the books that are associated with that time frame, and who, if it's in the south, like you'll see there, Isaiah, right there. He's in the south, and he is prophesying to the south around that time of those particular judges. And then you have a whole bunch of prophets that come out of the woodworks right about the time that Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers Jerusalem and carries away all of Israel and Judah, what was remaining with Judah, into captivity. Then you see those red lines. There's multiple times that Nebuchadnezzar came, and then there's a gap, and that last red line is whenever Cyrus releases the Jews to come back to Jerusalem to be able to rebuild the tabernacle, the temple. And you'll see there some books of some prophets right there. But notice that now, that little purple thing that I had, that little purple arrow. Notice it's smaller because that's the remnant that's left over, still carrying that seed promise, still carrying the genealogy that will lead to the Messiah. And so here now you're in the Christian age, and notice that purple arrow runs right into Jesus Christ. And then underneath Jesus Christ you have